For far too long, I have heard false, misleading, or simply inaccurate or out-of-date information being repeated over and over again about which tanking class is the best, why it's the best, what's the comparison between one class versus another. And yes, there are a lot of tank tier list videos out there. I've done some myself. I've also been part of the problem. So today what I want to do is I want to take an objective look at each tanking class, compare it. I've got a spreadsheet, a deep dive. This is not a tier list video. We're going far deeper than that, and it's just a comparative analysis, as I said in the title. So that's what we're going to do today. And besides just explaining to you, what the situation is, I want to explain to you why the situation is what it is. So if things change, you will know and you will understand, and you'll be able to see what's coming about as the change happens, because I think that's really the biggest problem. Okay, with that out of the way, let's start off with talking about some assumptions that have happened, or some presuppositions that I think most people have, and how I think most of them are wrong. So let's go ahead and start walking through it. So first up, Necros have poor stamina sustain. I hear this quite a bit, and you know what? If it's by a new player or someone progging new content for them, I would absolutely agree. The thing that we're going to see here in just a second is that Necros, though, don't have poor stamina sustain. Necros, the issue with them is that they can't recover stamina while blocking. And that's what everybody means when they say Necros have poor stamina sustain. They mean I'm having to block a lot, or I block a lot, period, even if I don't need to, and therefore I'm having issues with stamina. And so it's really not that Necros have poor stamina sustain, they have poor sustain while blocking. That's an important note, and it's really going to influence our decision making here in just a moment, which is why I bring it up. The second thing, DKs have excellent stamina sustain, and maybe the best stamina sustain, even while blocking. I'm going to show you that that's not true. It's just objectively not true. And while they are on the better end, there's other classes that are, one that's certainly better and another one that arguably is better. So we'll talk about that. And that's really the most important thing for a new tank. And then the next one here is that, DK is the best class. It has, the reason for that is because they have the toolkit for everything. That's something I've said historically, because historically it was true. With scribing and the changes with Oldsfield's contingency and various other changes to scribing, this is no longer true. Every class has the toolkit that they need to be able to tank successfully. So for that reason, that DK is quote unquote the best, it's just no longer true. And you'll see, guys, I'm going to recommend a DK in certain circumstances for certain things. And actually, to just kind of go into that briefly, categories we're going to cover is, first off, the most optimal. Okay, what is the best in an optimal group? Everybody cares about this when, most people shouldn't care about it. It's the same reason you see hard mode strats being done in pug groups, where it's like, why are we doing it this way? It's much harder than it would be if we did it a simpler way. But it's like, no, I saw somebody else doing it. I saw my favorite streamer doing it that way on some, 20-minute trifecta that they did, so we should do it that way. Doesn't make any sense. It's just because they don't, a lot of people don't understand. They don't have that deep of understanding of the game. Totally understandable. My point is not to, bash people for that, but, the idea that, the most optimal matters for most people is just not true. I'm covering it here because I know that that's what most people care about, even if they're not in that situation and will never be in that situation, which is most people, to be totally honest with you. And when I say most people, I mean most people doing hard modes, hard mode trials, hard mode, and trifectas. I'm talking about hard mode Dread Cell Reef. Most people don't need what's optimal in that situation. They need what is most easy and most survivable. And so that's what I mean by most people. I literally mean everybody but score pushers, basically, okay? There's reasons, we'll go into it. The second category here, most survivable and most new player friendly. Those are really, it's one category, but those things, it's best for new players and it's also most survivable. And the thing is that you'll find that you're always a new player, because if you're progressing through content, because the first time you go to do a hard mode, you're going to learn, it's going to be a huge step back for you. Yes, you've done veterans, you're ready for hard mode, you step in there and it's like you're new again and you're just in survival mode. Similarly, when you the first time you want to go do a trifecta, you're going to want to stay alive. That's going to be the priority, not keeping up a little bit better buff up times to do a little bit more DPS. You're not going to care. Your group's not going to care. If you're dying because you're trying to stagger or something and you're dropping block, they're going to tell you to take all stagger off your bar, right? They don't want you throwing the trifecta because of that. That really only comes into the picture when you're so good that it doesn't matter and you can do all of those things together, which again is a vanishingly small part of the community that actually score pushes. Okay, even though everybody and their dog wants to pretend like we're going to, it's just not the case. So survivability and new player friendliness, and again, that's for everybody. That's for 99.9% of the community. The third category here is kind of a special category, and it's really for, there's a couple of classes that have abilities that are just like a tier unto themselves that we'll have to talk about and go into. As a note, there's three optimal classes, primary optimal classes. There are three most survivable / new player friendly classes, and then there are two that I think fall into that special category, maybe 2.5. Now, and a couple of other things here that are also said. Sorc is absolutely the most survivable class. You know, people say that all the time and repeat it. Turns out that part is absolutely true, and we're going to see that really strongly in the data today. And then the last thing here is that Templars are the worst, or Nightblades are the worst. That's objectively not true. Nightblades are actually one of the best, and Templars are solid middle of the road. There's also this idea that Templars and Nightblades have a stationary play style. I've heard this repeated by people that are very experienced with the game, and I just don't think they know these classes very well. Templars and Nightblades both have an ability that if you are stationary, it's like S tier. It's like does this really cool stuff. But if you ignore being stationary, these abilities are great by themselves. They're just as good, if not actually better than most other classes' abilities of that same type. So I think that's a huge misunderstanding. There's also been misunderstandings about several of these classes. Things have changed, and it's been over a year, and people still repeat the same information, thinking that Templars used to be hot garbage. And they just were. Unfortunately, I tried them. They just weren't very good as tanks. That's not the case anymore. Nightblades, same deal. People, I mean, they haven't been hot garbage in a long time, but people thought they didn't have a burst heal. And then one person with a large community following thought that, and they just repeated it, and other people repeated it, and nobody actually knew or actually bothered to take an objective and fresh look at the class to know that that wasn't true. Okay, hopefully I have established for you that there are conceptions, and maybe misconceptions that a lot of people have, even if you don't, and you know, we want to take a fresh and objective look. So let's actually go ahead and do that. We're gonna start off here, and we're gonna go through this spreadsheet. I will note that I have some standardized testing conditions. I'll actually pop that up on the screen right now. Basically, everybody's in the same gear. Everybody's got the same Mundus. Everybody's got the same traits on that gear. It's literally the exact same gear. Everybody's got about 40k health. We're buffed from the trial dummy. We have all heavy. We're running 3 infused, and we've got, you know, a 10% mag recovery on everybody from PvP skills. Okay, so roughly that's the gist of it. Same food, same everything else. Okay, so we're doing an apples to apples comparison. I will also note that I have guides. I have, like, you know, suggested skill loadouts on all of these classes on nightherogaming.com. And if you want to go see, like, how do I set up these particular classes, you can go there and see it. I will note some of those are a work in progress. In the process of doing this, I actually changed my opinion on what some skills that should be in there, but roughly that's what I'm running here. It's close enough. Okay. So to start off with, let's go with Magicka and Stamina Recovery. And I have turned this into, so for those who don't know, recoveries tick every 2 seconds. So the number you see for recovery is actually every 2 seconds. Here I've changed it to a per second so that we can kind of compare it to other things that happen every second, just for ease of comparison. So for Magicka Recovery, we can see that within a couple of hundred, everybody's basically the same. We're going to see for other reasons, as we talked about, right? Recovering stamina while blocking is what really matters for the stamina recovery. Again, we see Arcanist a decent amount ahead of the lowest classes and really everybody. And they just have really good sustain. I will note that they have stamina costing skills that you really need to use, so they really need that sustain. So again, this isn't the whole picture here. They actually still struggle with sustain because of the stamina costing abilities they have. So keep that in mind. Again, this isn't the whole picture. We want to look at, we're gonna divide it up, but then we want to also take a step back and look at everything. All right, now what I'm calling special recoveries, okay, for lack of a better term. So I'm going to start off here with the 3 classes that can regenerate stamina while blocking. So first up here is going to be the Dragon Knight. So Dragon Knights, if they cast typically Igneous Shield, but you could also use Igneous Weapons, they can basically convert 3 Magicka to 1 stamina. So it's like 2,500 Magicka, 3,000 Magicka into 1,000 stamina. So that is something that they can do that a lot of people can't do. Now, I will note with this, it really the skill that makes sense to do this is Igneous Shield. Igneous Shield is no longer needed and really that desirable on a DK. The only reason you really want to run Igneous is literally for this extra recovery. So I think that really detracts a lot from this. It's still there for newer players if you really need it, but it really does detract quite a bit from the overall utility of this skill. Next up here on the Sorcerer. Sorcerers, this is absolutely cracked. Now, you do need to draw block for this, and it takes 1 second. For those who don't know, a heavy attack takes 1.8 seconds. So it is a lot better than a heavy attack, but I will note you do have to drop your block to be able to do this. Oh, I'm sorry, for the DK skills, that was a Helping Hands passive using Igneous Shield. And then again, we're using Dark Deal on the Sorcerer, which will drop block. Also, Unholy Knowledge, just as kind of an aside, does a 6% cost reduction. So that's actually pretty significant as well. It's like 150, magic or stamina per second reduction in cost of abilities, but you cast this ability and you continue to get back stamina afterwards for a number of seconds for quite a while. And so that's why I said, hey, this is kind of special and you can get this back while blocking. Third here is going to be the Nightblade. Nightblades, just passively, they'll get some recoveries from siphoning strikes, or siphoning attacks rather, but you can also cast the ability to trade 4,000 health for 2.6k magicka and stamina. That's huge. I will also note that 4k health is about what you heal passively just on a Nightblade as long as you have all your buffs up. So I would argue in a lot of ways this is basically free. Another cool thing about this is you do not need to drop block for this. So this is one of the only classes that can infinitely sustain by just trading a little bit of health, which is basically free on a Nightblade, for more magicka and stamina both. So I think because of this, it's one of the major reasons why Nightblade is like top tier. Arguably top tier, but maybe just like one down or something as far as being the most survivable and beginner friendly class. There are other reasons. We'll go into that more in depth when we get to the class specific section. Now, other special recoveries here, we have a 5% cost reduction on the Templar. The Warden, while you're healing an ally with a green balance ability, you can get 250 magic or stamina, whichever is lower. This is like, you can do this with sweaty groups, so it's important to include here. Most people are not going to be able to do this, and certainly no new player should be trying to do this. You'll probably die trying to do it, but it is critically important to heal the party if you're the only Warden in the group, and these recoveries are actually quite nice here. So worth mentioning, but also hard to say like where this falls in as far as like making the overall class choice easier. Now, let's take a look at our while blocking recoveries. The thing that really matters, right? This is the thing that we talked about on a Necromancer. You can see they have none. And that's why people say Necromancers have such poor stamina sustain. What they really mean is they have such poor stamina sustain while blocking. Okay, so we'll start on the left here with the Dragon Knight. Now, Dragon Knights have the Combustion passive. In addition to being able to cast the skill to get back stamina, they have the Combustion passive that while a target, they have applied burning to a target, this procs and they get 1,000 magicka and stamina back. And I believe that's once every 3 seconds. Yeah, once every 3 seconds this can proc. Now, moving on, we have the Arcanist. So if you use Recuperative Treatise, which I think most, honestly, Arcanist builds don't, you can get 120 per second equivalent while blocking. I don't think most people are going to do this, and so I think this is another one of those reasons why the Arcanist has such poor stamina sustain, and you need to run a Sword board on them, or it's advisable to. I think Arcanist is the one class where like you're not losing anything from running a Sword board on them because they have the Rune of the Colorless Pool. More about that later, but just note here, this is actually, even though it's 120, I typically wouldn't, I wouldn't count this, and it's still less than most of the other classes. Then we have the Sorcerer. So technically, you cannot really get back while blocking, except for your Dark Deal has a portion where you'll continue to regen stam after you've cast it. The thing is that the Dark Deal is so good. You trade 1.8k mag for 6,000 stamina. It's ridiculous, and that's including the stamina over time. That's ridiculous. That's an insane amount of stamina. And so even while they don't technically have any recoveries while blocking, you can drop block for a second on any fight, and that's a stupid amount of stamina to get back. So honestly, Dark Deal is like S tier. It's pretty unique. So even though they don't have any here, I still wouldn't hold that against them in this regard. Again, things are more complicated than they might first seem. Next up here is Nightblade. Siphoning attacks. Siphoning attacks, just by being on your bar, as long as you're doing damage, will give you back 200 stamina and magicka every second. You don't really have to do much besides keep your wall of elements down, which you need to do anyways. Pretty hooked up, pretty amazing, and honestly, it's on par with, as we saw, with the Dragon Knight, and similar to what we'll see with the Warden and Templar. Now, let's move on to the Templar. We've got Runic Focus. I will note with the Warden and the Templar, you have to choose a morph of a skill that could otherwise give you back magicka. Now, that might not seem like that big of a deal, but later on, as you get more experience, you'll want more magicka because you'll be casting more abilities, and ideally, you would swap this over if you can, but just realize it's not as good as like the Nightblade or the Dragon Knight, which can, and the Arcanist, which get both of each recovery. So again, Runic Focus, a really great skill, one you're always going to be using. It provides you with a bit of heal over time, provides you with major resolve, and it also provides you with these cut recoveries. So pretty hooked up overall. And then on the Warden, if you choose the Bull Net, you can recover stamina. Now, this is, so Runic Focus you're always going to be using, but with the Bull Net, you're really only using it for the recoveries. I mean, yes, it cleanses you, but that's not that big of a deal in most situations. So you're really giving up a lot of really expensive bar space for a skill that's not that good. So even though this is like looks comparable to the Nightblade, the Templar, and the Dragon Knight, it's really not. It's worse than all three of them because of the fact that this skill doesn't really do that much else for you that is meaningful. And then last up here, we have the Necromancer, which is... So, guys, I main a Necromancer tank. I absolutely love it. And you can see just nothing here. What we're going to see with the Necromancer is that, you know, it's a high risk, high reward type playstyle. It's very difficult, but the reward is quite high. So just realize that. And then the total gain mag per second here, I've just kind of equated that out for you if it's important, just so you can kind of see, obviously, the Arcanist and the Nightblade are going to be the top ones there, really, really high. We also see that the Dragon Knight can be quite high, as can the Sorcerer. And then, you know, the Warden and Templar, it's actually pretty low, but we do have a little bit of cost reduction on the Templar, and if you run kind of a sweatier setup with the Warden, you can also get some extra recoveries that puts them on par with the other classes. And then again, the Necromancer is kind of middle of the road. Okay, all of that together, what's the takeaway from this section? Well, the main thing is I would say Sorcerer is like S tier, okay? Dark Deal is just absolutely broken. They also have just generally high recoveries, and, you know, using something like Unholy Knowledge for the extra cost reduction, they're incredibly high. Now, you do have to drop block for that. So for a beginning player, that drops the Sorcerer down a tier, but generally speaking, Sorcerer, top tier, it's the best one. Next up here is going to be the Nightblade. Nightblade gives you the 200 recoveries every second, whether you do anything or not, and it's just passive for doing damage, which you should always be doing something. That's amazing. But then if you cast a skill, you don't have to drop block. You can trade a little bit of health, not that much. You're getting healed 4k a second anyways, just from all of your other passives, to get 2.6k magicka and stamina back. And you can hit this multiple times if you need it without dropping block. That means on a Nightblade, you can permanently block on a Nightblade and never have to drop block. Okay, so for beginning players, that's going to be the absolutely the best class. And there are other reasons for that, which we'll get to in the class section, why Nightblade is the best class for a beginning player, but it just absolutely is, and we can see it here. Now, a close third, still very much in this category when we're just considering, you know, just resources back, is going to be the Dragon Knight. And again, it's lost a lot in recent years because now you really don't need to proc the combustion passive. I'm sorry, the helping hands passive with Igneous Shield, because you really typically don't want to even be running Igneous Shield anymore. So really you just have the combustion passive, which puts it on par with the Nightblade and you know, still below the Sorc, but it's still quite good. You just need to make sure that you have a skill on your bar that's actually procking. And I see DK builds all the time that don't have this an ability or a way of consistently procking this, you know, this passive. And so honestly, they're not getting the recoveries that they should be getting in a lot of situations, or they're doing things that are just wrong or suboptimal. Okay. Now, after that, those are the top three. After that, we have Templar and Warden kind of in the middle. Arcanist, you know, it gets a bunch of just static recoveries, but it doesn't get anything back while blocking, so it's kind of towards the low end of the list. And then Necro is bringing up the absolute bottom of the list with no recoveries while blocking. Now, here's the thing to note, guys. As you look at this and you see the recoveries while blocking on these classes, like DK, right? DK has long been considered to be, it has such great sustain, and it wasn't just because of spamming Igneous Shield. It was because of being able to recover stamina while blocking. Here's the thing. If you just run a red guard gets the equivalent of 200 stamina back per second while blocking. So you can run a red guard Necro and be just as good as all of these other classes in most regards, okay? Now, you don't have on-demand, press a button, get back more stamina, so it's going to be still below the Dragon Knight, still below the Nightblade, still below the Sorcerer, but it puts you pretty much on par. And as I've gone over and over again, I'm going to keep saying it because people still don't know or understand it. You can, any race can get to resistance cap, and you don't need to give up crazy, awesome sustain or whatever. Hyper's done some videos. They're a bit old. There was some incorrect information or incorrect assumptions in those videos. You don't need to change your jewelry. Please never do that. And you certainly don't need to change your Mundus. Please also don't do that. There are other ways of getting to resistance cap on any race, any class. If you don't know, I've got guides here on the channel. Look at my complete, general guide to tanking or whatever. It's like the first thing I cover. Okay. Sorry. It's just really important that people understand that so they understand the choices that they're making. All right. Now let's go ahead and move on to unique damage mitigation. All right. So these are sources that you can't get everywhere else. And again, with scribing, this has changed. So it used to be that certain classes had easier ways or unique ways of getting buffs that other classes really had to struggle to get. And that's no longer the case with scribing now. So things have changed quite a bit. So when we're looking at classes, we're really just looking at their unique ones, the ones that nobody else can get because they're specific to that class. So to start off here with Arcanist, we have our 6% you can get from Crux Generation from Runic Sunder. This is worth mentioning here, which is obviously why I mentioned it, but you have to, it's 2% per Crux, up to 3 Crux. And the thing is that you can't really control this because you're going to be gaining and losing Crux all the time. So while this is cool to note, it's not really important because you can't always control when you have Crux. And the TLDRs, you're always going to be gaining and losing Crux, okay? So it may or may not help you that much. Next up here, there's nothing else or really anybody else except for the Necro. Necros have their Spirit Mender, which will just reduce all of their damage taken, absorbs it by 10%. That's huge. Don't have to do anything besides keep your Spirit Mender up, reduces your damage by 10%. Next up here is block mitigation. So block mitigation, I think a lot of people way overvalue block mitigation. So let's just talk about it first, though. So we have DKs with 10%, we have Templars with 10%, and then we have Wardens with 12%. And then Sorcerers can cast an ability to get 40%, which they're already going to have on their bar anyways on hard-hitting fight. So Sorcerers, this is crazy. The thing about block mitigation on most classes, not talking about the Sorcerer here, is that you can instead use CP and other forms of block mitigation to get close to cap or close enough to cap. So you can run something like Bracing Anchor, which will reduce your damage. It'll be a 20% extra block mitigation. I'm sorry, let me put it that way. So it's twice as good as most of these other classes. I will tell you that even running the hardest content in the game, I probably should use Bracing Anchor sometimes. I never do. I'm not saying it's not good. I'm not saying you shouldn't. I'm just saying I tend to roll dodge attacks if I need to. And even when I don't, I typically don't need it. Now, I'm not saying it's not good and I shouldn't. Like Kind's Aegis, third floor, I should be using Bracing Anchor. Why am I not doing it? It's a good idea, but just realize it's twice as good as any class buff. So while this is helpful and it's nice to know about, I don't think these are significant enough, except for in the case of the Sorcerer, which is 4 times as good as everybody else's. I don't think it's that important. I think you could slot Bracing Anchor or do something else. You could also run Cerabane's Ward as a one piece. There's a lot of other things you can do to buff mitigation. I would note that I really don't recommend running Immovable. And the reason I don't recommend that is because it costs like 4,000 stamina and you need stamina to block. And I've seen people similarly with stamina costing shields, people cast the stamina costing shield and then don't have the stamina to block and they die anyway. So I don't really recommend those things, but there are plenty of other ways to get to block cap or close enough at least. All right, and then dot mitigation. As you can see, it's really just the Necro. 15% from the Disdain Harm passive. This is huge. This is massive, and this will absolutely make Necro, and does make Necro, one of the best classes to tank on certain dot-heavy fights. And so even though they don't have everything else, they do have this. So it is significant to note here. Next up is going to be Class Armor. Class Armor, guys, it's really the whole benefit of having armor on your class is the opportunity benefit, okay? So if we have a lot of extra armor, we can change CP. Maybe, we've already noted that, like, if you are on a Nord, you get extra armor, but you don't have to be. So, it really just depends. What that extra armor does is it lets you change some of your CP to something else that would give you another benefit. Now, I would note that if you're going for recoveries in the red CP, the best you can do is an extra 90 recoveries, again, ticking every 2 seconds. So in our sheet, that's 45 per second, is the best you can do for recoveries, which is the main thing you want. Not really that big of a deal, right? So maybe you go with an extra 10% increase in your shield size. Maybe you go with a reduced cost of your shield. Maybe you slot, that bracing anchor like we talked about. Whatever it is, it's really about the opportunity cost here. And so those things are nice. You could also change and not run defending on your front bar, or not run like a two-piece set on your front bar and run something else that had a defensive bonus. Anyways, it's the opportunity cost there, guys. It's a little bit outside the scope of this video. Just realize it's a nice to have, but it doesn't really matter that much. Again, with the exception of the Arcanist, which just has so much that you can kind of do some silly things potentially with them, like not running very much heavy armor or something like that. So just keep that in mind. Mostly this is the opportunity value of being able to swap out your CP or have a different, setup on your front bar. Next up here, and this is the really important thing, honestly, but minor protection and minor resolve. So now with scribing, you can put one of these on Ulfsild's contingency, and everybody can and probably should be using it, at least in certain circumstances, hard-hitting fights, to get those buffs. Now, the only thing that comes up is when you don't have either, because then you need to find a second source to get that other buff. Now, typically, in an ideal situation, you will be getting minor resolve from your healers, but in reality, there are plenty of fights where you will not, and plenty of pugs where you will not be getting this buff, and so you need to find it for yourself to make sure you're at resistance cap. And really, the only issue here is DKs don't have either one of those. So what you can do for minor protection, historically, is slot in the Psijic Ultimate, which will give you minor protection just as a passive, and then you could run minor resolve on Ulfsild's contingency. Here's the deal. If you do that, you lose 10% Magicka recovery from the passives of running barrier on your front bar. So that means you're losing Magicka recovery. So there is a cost to this, and really, as you look at all of this, there's really 3 things that stick out that are really important. So first up is Bound Aegis, the 40% block recovery is like a tier unto itself. That's really important. The other thing is, not having either one of these does reduce your overall Magicka recovery by a decent amount, a noticeable amount. And then I would say probably the only other thing here is like unique damage reduction, which we see that the Necro has the highest, right, at 25% additively. Okay, so those are the 3 things to really take away. Because of that, Necro is going to be the best. It's going to be the winner in this tier. Second here is going to be the Arcanist because of that massive amount of armor that they get, and also that 6% crux. And again, since they get so much armor, guys, there's really a case to be running a red card on all classes, I think, but especially on an Arcanist, because you're going to struggle with your stamina sustain on them, especially with those stamina costing abilities if you have to use them. And then the third thing is that DK here does lose a little bit because they have to find some other source of both of these buffs to be on par with everybody else. So there's an opportunity cost, associated with that. Okay, now let's move on to healing. So first up here, the DK. We see that I'm using Green Dragon's Blood here, and I will note that I made sure that it was proccing for more. And I know you can use Coagulating Blood. I'm being generous to the Dragon Knight here, okay? I brought my health down significantly, fairly low, because I think that's ideally when you would be casting this. So with all of these classes, I'm trying to figure out situations that make sense for you to use it, and not ideal necessarily, but beneficial situations to make the skill or ability or class look the best. Within reason, okay? So we get 13.5k heal from Green's Dragon's Blood, and we're basically looking at the cost, like HP per mag, at a ratio of 4.0. I thought this ratio is really helpful for knowing the efficiency of a heal, and so that's why I've kind of done that calculation. Here on the Arcanist, this is a little tricky. So Evolving Runemen can basically heal for the same amount, costing about the same. The thing is, it costs stamina, and most people, if your stamina is higher than your magicka, which most builds will be, the thing is that they have a shield that also gives them a massive heal, and they have really good shields, so I don't think you're really going to be casting as much, if at all. You might not even use this period. You might use something like Resolving Vigor or something else as a hot. There's a lot of other options, but I just put it here for a roughly apples to apples comparison. Just realize it's actually worse than it seems because it does cost stamina versus magicka in most normal situations. I have played around with stacking more mag than stam on a Arcanist. That build will be out soon. All right, next up is going to be the Sorcerer. And this is another kind of tricky situation because on a Sorcerer, you really actually use Hardened Ward. Hardened Ward is their shield and it heals you for 5k. And it's also a massive shield. So I find myself not using my burst heal hardly at all, and I mostly use Vibrant Shroud for the various buffs. I will also note you could instead use Dark Deal, and it will heal you for like 14k, and it's incredibly cheap. So if you're looking from a pure survival perspective, maybe putting Dark Deal would make more sense here, but I typically will choose to use Vibrant Shroud and won't use Dark Deal unless I don't really need it most of the time. So that's why this is the typical loadout that I'm comparing. Just know that Dark Deal would be even higher. You have to drop block to be able to cast it. So that's important to note. And then on the Nightblade, we have Shrewd Offering. A lot of people for the longest time didn't know or didn't realize, and then people have repeated it. I've heard it from the Tank Club, I've heard it from Hyper, that Nightblades don't have a burst heal. They absolutely do. It's Shrewd Offering. That's what you should use. It's a good heal. It's fairly efficient. It heals you for about the amount that a combat prayer would heal. It's not as nearly as big as some of the other classes, but it's really cheap and it's fairly efficient. So that's kind of nice. Next up would be Honor the Dead on the Templar. Now, I am assuming you're only casting this when you're below 75% health. And because of that, you get most of the cost recovered. So while it is expensive to cast, it heals you for a decent amount, about 10k, and it's really efficient, giving a 6.3 hit point to mag ratio on the heal versus, so that's 50% better than like a DK, Arcanist, or a Nightblade as far as their burst heal. So incredibly efficient. Just make sure you're not casting it when you're mostly full on health, because that's incredibly inefficient. I will also note here on the Nightblade and on the Templar, people will repeat and will say, and I have friends that feel this way, so it's a valid way to feel, but we'll say that, the Nightblade and the Templar, that heal can go on somebody else, and so that's bad. I play a lot on a Nightblade tank, and a decent amount I've played on a Templar tank. I have never once had that be a problem where it caused me to die. It's maybe one or two times is maybe like, oh no, oh crap, it went on the wrong person. But mostly it's completely fine, honestly. And then the other thing, it's actually good, because if you're in a pug or if you're any group really, and you see somebody, maybe it's the other tank. I find this a lot of times in training groups. I will sit there when I'm the off tank and I'm trying to train them how to be a main tank. I can give them a little bit of a heal, or I can keep them alive. They're like, oh, they're about to die. I, as the tank, can heal somebody to keep them alive. You can help with tombs if you're in Sunspire. A lot of situations where people are just standing in one person standing in AoE. They're new. They don't know what they're doing. They're taking a bunch of extra damage, and you can help keep them alive and be like, hey, don't stand there, dude. Do you see your health yo-yoing? Yeah, it's because I'm spamming heals on you. So I actually think that this going on another target, far from being a detriment, which I've heard many people, again, even my friends, say it's actually a huge benefit. And it would be cool if all tank heals did this. You can't do that on a DK. You can do that with Evolving Runemen on the Arcanist. That's another class that can do it. But you can't do that on some of these other classes. So keep that in mind. I think it's really huge. Vibrant Shroud, you kind of can, but it doesn't heal for nearly as much. So it's not as good, and it's really expensive as well. Not being incredibly efficient. Next up, Polar Winds. Polar Winds is the top tier here as far as heals. It heals for like 35k over total over 10 seconds. You get a burst heal, which is a little bit less than 50% of that, and then you get this huge heal over time. Typically, I cast this, I mean, the efficiency on this is 2.5 times the average heal, like what you would find on a DK or a Nightblade at 10.8. Okay, so that's the how many HP you get per mag spent. Crazy efficient. Also, the hot portion of this is significant enough that typically I'll just let it tick down. You don't need to spam polar winds. It's really expensive. Just, you know, and even if you do have to spam it, I would note it still has a 4.9% efficiency because, again, about half of that total heal is the burst heal up front, and it also heals a second target. So it heals you and somebody else. Really great for helping out with tombs, really great for helping keep people alive if they're standing in red, that kind of thing. It's a massive heal, S tier for the Warden here. And then next up is going to be Hungering Scythe on the Necro. And again, guys, I'm a Necro tank main, okay? The Necro Scythe, people talk about this like it's this amazing heal, and it's just objectively not, okay? We're talking about, yes, it has a decent heal over time, but that heal is over 10 seconds. And unlike the Warden, that heal is not enough that I would rely on it. I constantly have to recast this ability for more heals to be able to keep myself alive. It's not something where you'll get the full 10-second benefit of that hot. You'll have to cast it again before it's over. Yes, it does more healing if it hits more targets, but that is rarely important. I mean, trash, some fights, a few fights where there's like several mobs you're on, I mean, the Reef Guardian is like one of the few I can think of, but even then, it's really inefficient. If you're just using the burst heal, it's a 3.7 ratio, which is worse than just about every other class and doesn't give any buffs like the Sorcerer does. So it's just not that great, okay? If the hot fully ticks down, it is the most efficient, but that almost never happens for me. So I don't really think Scythe is all that great. I love my Necro. The other thing is that Scythe has to hit somebody. You have to hit a target. That's incredibly difficult on some fights. So, yeah, let's just go on to the tier list. So, Warden, S tier in this category, by far the highest. Second here is going to be the Templar, very strong heals. Third would be Sorc. Again, I know Dark Deal is a massive heal. It's like 14k, incredibly cheap. If you're going to use that for your heal, you do have to drop block, so that takes away from it. Arguably, a Sorcerer just for your own like well-being, you could argue that's just as good as a Warden. It doesn't really matter. It's just kind of situational. It's incredibly good. 1 through 3 here, all very high. If you want to say Sorc, if you're using a different heal, it's better. Sure. I don't mind. Sorc, incredibly good. No matter what, it's totally fine. Templar, also very good. Okay. Then there's everybody in the middle. Okay. And then there's DK and Necro towards the bottom. The DK heal, having to wait to your low health to cast it, doesn't feel good on Green Dragon's Blood. And if you instead use Coagulating Blood, it's just not that great of a heal. It's fine. That's a class you can use a lot of shields on, but it doesn't feel great. And then the Necro, having to be in melee range, and again, it just doesn't heal for that much. It just really knocks it down several tiers. Necro going to come in dead last as far as healing. Okay, now let's go ahead and move on and talk about shielding. Are you guys tired yet? I'm just getting warmed up here. Okay, so shielding on a DK, 14.3k with hardened armor. Massive shield, incredibly efficient, okay? 7.9 is the ratio here, twice what most of the other classes are, okay? So this is Hardened Ward, an incredibly efficient heal, more than makes up, or makes up, I guess, for having kind of one of the weaker heals here. Now, next up is going to be the Arcanist. I typically run Spite Ward of the Lucent Mind because each crux you have when you cast it reduces the cost by 30%. It's pretty amazing, but a lot of people run the other morph, whatever, it's fine. Either one of them heals, if you have 3 Crux, heals you for 14k, in addition to being a normal size shield at 12.3k. All right. This is honestly what I use a lot of times for my burst heal on an Arcanist, but it works different. So it's just kind of an interesting skill. If we just look at the shield portion, though, we're still at a 4.0 ratio of HP to mag. Still very good. If you have at least 1 Crux and you're running the Spite Ward of the Lucent Mind like I do, it becomes very efficient at 5.7. And if you have 2 or 3, it's like it can be a free 14k heal and because it could be a 90% reduction at 3 crux, and also giving you this massive shield. It's kind of S tier, honestly. It's incredibly high up there. This is a pretty crazy skill. Either morph, still amazing. The other morph just shields for more, but doesn't have the reduced cost. Next up is Sorcerer. Also arguably kind of an S tier thing. So it's twice as big as the average shield at 21k. Hardened Ward also heals you from passives for about 5k whenever you cast it. Honestly, on a Sorcerer, I typically use this as my main heal if I need some heals, and then just let the healer top me off as the massive shield, right? So this is 7.2. It's up there with Hardened Armor. It's really efficient and also provides the heal. Notice that the efficiency here on these shields, it's just for the shielding portion. I'm not even adding in the healing you get here. So all 3 of these first shields, pretty amazing, to be totally honest with you. They're pretty awesome. Next up here is going to be Warden Contingency, and that's going to be because the Nightblade, the Warden, and the Necromancer don't have a class shield. So these are all the same. You can actually get the cost of this down to 2.1k if you have all the Mage's Guild passives. I am assuming that a lot of people won't. I know none of my tanks, like 1 or 2 of them does, but most of them do not. And so Warden Contingency is typically going to be a little bit more expensive. 4.2 on the ratio here. It's decent. Next up here is going to be the Templar Radiant Ward. Radiant Ward is a significant shield. It gives you 20% more value per target hit, and I am assuming here that you're at least going to hit 1 target. There could be situations where that won't be true, but I think most of the time you're going to at least hit 1 target, and so you get a 5.2 ratio here. Pretty nice, pretty massive shield at 16.5k. If you're hitting 3 targets, this is actually a little bit better than Hardened Ward, if my math is correct, which could be a little bit off, or at least it's the equivalent. If you only have 2 targets, it's going to be a little bit worse than Hardened Ward. So the second biggest heal, potentially, depending on what morph, of course, you use with your Arcanist. Still amazing. It also provides, some passive bonuses. It's a great skill. And then again, for the Warden and the Necromancer, kind of coming in towards the end with no self heals or no self shields, similar to the Nightblade. All right, so here I would say Arcanist S tier. No matter what morph you use, it's just an insane heal. It can be really cheap or it can be really large. Either morph, pick your poison. It's amazing. Second is going to be the Sorcerer. I mean, the heal and the massive shield, it's twice as big as most of the other shields. I mean, that's pretty huge, and it heals you for 5k. And it's efficient. It's not that expensive. It's crazy good. Third here is going to be the DK. It's incredibly cheap, and it's still it's a good size shield. It's pretty great. Templar, third here. Basically all the classes with a class shield, they have really good class shields. There's reason to run all of them, in addition to running Warding Contingency potentially on all of these classes, using Warding more for the buff. All right, and then the rest, the good news is everybody's been brought up to this base level. It used to be the classes without a shield were far below all the classes with a shield. Ulfsild's Contingency has basically made up for that. So while those 3 classes are really nice, everybody here is still not too far below them. Okay, all of that said, how does all this shake out? Well, if we go back and take a look, we see under Sustain, Sorcerer, Nightblade, Dragon Knight, top 3 there. Under Damage Mitigation, Necro and Arcanist, really at the top, everybody else somewhere below them. Dragon Knight being one of the lowers, honestly, on total damage mitigation because the fact that they don't have minor protection and minor resolve. Another note about that, if you don't have either one of these and you run Resolving Vigor, that's totally fine, and that is an option. Running Resolving Vigor for your source of minor resolve so that you can then run Ulfsild's Contingency for your minor protection, that's the equivalent of 145 stamina per second just to keep your minor resolve, which means your stamina recovery is actually worse than it appears to be able to get all the buffs that you would want and need, especially if you're like running around solo. Maybe you're solo tanking a dungeon or something like that. So that actually is a significant detriment to the Dragon Knight in their sustain category. And then third here, we're talking about healing. I honestly don't think healing matters that much on a tank. As long as it does the job. The only 2 things is that the DK and the Necro, I don't like their healing. It doesn't feel like they typically have enough for me. I still get by just fine on my DK, but there are issues with both of those. But honestly, healing doesn't matter that much. In really sweaty groups, tanks don't even need heals because they're always getting heals from the healer. That is not the reality that most of us live in, though. So heals actually do matter in that situation. Warden S tier, Templar's good, Sork's amazing. Those three are at the top, and then DK and Necro towards the bottom, or at the bottom rather. With I think Necro being at the absolute bottom. And then for shielding, again, Arcanist, Sork, Dragon Knight, Templar, all incredibly high, and then everybody else kind of in the mid tier. So how does this shake out? Well, I think that we can say firmly that Sorcerer is absolutely the best, most survivable tank if we're just considering all of these things, which I think, and with a lot of other stuff. So Sorcerer, top tier. I think Nightblade for survivability is going to be the second one there. They have just ways of getting back block, resources. So Nightblade, up there with a Sorcerer. It doesn't come in nearly as good on all these other categories, but the fact that you can get back a ton of stamina while blocking, I think Nightblade is up there. Third after that is going to be Dragon Knight, again, because of those recoveries while blocking, ways of converting Magicka to stamina. We saw some things that, though, will detract from how, useful they are and kind of make, things that we thought were amazing aren't maybe quite as good as we thought. And then after that, guys, honestly, I don't really think the rest of it matters too much. It's really other factors that are going to come into play. I don't think any of them are particularly easy or hard to use, more so than the other three. I just think that the three that can get back stamina while blocking and other reasons that go along with them, put them for survivability at the top, and then everything else is really on the second tier. Nothing really goes below that except for the Necromancer, okay? So how I would divide this up is I'd say Sorcerer, Nightblade, DK, and then everybody else. So Arcanist, Templar, Warden, kind of in the middle there. And then Warden is at the bottom of that middle tier. And then beneath them is as far as ease of use, is the Necro. Necro is by far the hardest to use and by far the most difficult class. Now, we'll see in a minute that there are other reasons why you might want to run a Necro. They can do some amazing things, but as far as just staying alive, Necros fall at the bottom of the list. I'm sorry, it's just the way it is. And again, I'm a Necro main, giving my favorite class the lowest ranking for survivability, ease of use, and that beginner friendliness, okay? That's just how things shake out. Okay, now let's talk about most optimal, all right? So I'm going to spoil this. DK is at the top of the list, maybe not for all the reasons you think. We'll talk about it in a second. Sorcerer, also very high on the list, and Necro, high on the list. Okay, those are the top three. Necro, it can generate crazy amounts of ultimate, but it's mainly for the Colossus and for their survivability on those dot-based fights because it is so high, and those are some really important fights in hard modes. Next is the Sorcerer. Sorcerer can provide the unique buffs with, several unique buffs, but also having the Storm Atronach can be very important for that major berserk. And the fact that they are so survivable that you don't have to worry about them dying in the middle of your trifecta, most situations, because they have everything they need. They're incredibly survivable. So Sork is up there because of those, mainly, I think those two reasons, but, buffs and being able to survive. Okay. Here's the deal though, guys. On all of these situations, like for example with the DK provides igneous weapons, it also provides stagger, and then it also provides a unique buff for the group. The thing is that you can get those buffs from your DK DPS. Your DK DPS can do stagger. They can do igneous weapons. The situation is they don't want to most of the time, and other situations, when you have a split group, you might want two DKs, and so you put your DPS on one side and your tank on the other, and both sides have all of those buffs. So DK stays at the top there. People have been used to it. People have them. People have DK tanks. And, there's other reasons as well, like being able to permanently magma shell in some situations. We'll get to that later. But DK tanks go absolutely at the top of that list for all those reasons. But there is no meta reason why you couldn't run a different tanking class. It really comes down to a DPS wanting big numbers and not wanting to have... DPS hate being buff DPS. They want to run a parse class. They want the huge numbers. And so they're not going to just put all these extra skills on their bar, make their job more difficult just because someone wants to run a Nightblade tank, for example. And then again, as I mentioned, there are certain situations where having all those buffs in two different places can be very useful. So that's why I think the DK kind of stays there at the top. The Sorcerer, we kind of went through it. They're incredibly survivable. They have the Storm Atro. They provide some unique buffs. You need at least one in a group, but you might be in a situation where you have two and you put one on one side, one on the other. It makes a lot of sense. And then the Necro. Having an extra Colossus can just work out with the timing. And then having a tank that's really good at taking a lot of dot damage can also work out really well. That's why we like the Necro for optimal groups, okay? So those are the top three. If you want to run something that's optimal, you want to make sure that, a lot of times people, again, in average groups, will try to do incredibly sweaty strats in trifectas, in hard modes that they don't need to do. It just is the way it is. And I can't really say anything else. The other thing, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention about the Dragon Knight. Being able to permanently Magma Shell is a strat in certain really sweaty groups. And it just allows you to leave everything in one place and do a whole bunch of damage. And it burns through damage, burns through mechanics, so you don't have to deal with them. And it makes the fight easier if the DK can just sit there permanently Magma Shelled, and no other class can do that. So again, that's another reason why you might periodically, you're going to absolutely want a Dragon Knight. Everybody already has one. They're good otherwise. They provide buffs that a DPS doesn't want to do. So why not use them? And so that's why Dragon Knight is staying king. I wish it could get knocked off that mountain, but until, maybe if they did away with stagger, if stagger stopped being a thing, possibly DKs could be dethroned, but even then they're still going to be really good, and they're still going to be wanted for a lot of situations, so they're going to be very common in game, and people will get used to running them in their groups, so they're probably not going anywhere. All right, now that we've gone through all that, and I know it was a lot, let's actually deep dive into each particular class, because there's a lot of things that we didn't really cover that we can go more in depth on, and this is I'm supposed to be a complete and most in-depth comparative analysis done on tanks, I think ever, but certainly in recent memory. So let's keep going. So for Dragon Knights here, we're going to start off with the recoveries. We've gone over, while blocking recoveries, we've gone over the combustion and helping hands, CPs, passives. Honorable mention here to Battle Roar. I don't think we really talked about that. Battle Roar, whenever you use an ultimate on a DK, you get back 50 of each resource per ultimate spent. And so basically what this allows you to do, if you're in a bad situation, you have kind of an oh shit moment, like maybe you're in Cloud Rest down in Portals, you can pop any ultimate, could be barrier, doesn't matter what it is, and you'll get back a ton of resources. So this makes you very survivable, and in a panic moment, this can be really helpful. The thing is, I didn't really add this in because this isn't something you'll be doing necessarily consistently enough that it really factors in. There might be some extreme situations, but this is mostly just kind of a nice to have sort of thing. For unique damage mitigation, we actually already talked about this. The armor, as we noted, is really all about the opportunity cost. What else could we get here instead of being a Nord, or instead of running other some CP or something like that? So just keep that in mind. Healing and shielding we went through. Special utility. So we talked about Magma Shell. It makes you unkillable for 10 seconds, which is absolutely crazy. And then if you use Elfbane, you can get some extension on that. An amazing ability. You can basically ignore mechanics with this ability, and a lot of groups use this to their advantage to kind of ignore mechanics for the tank and burn things down really quickly. Okay, now let's talk about these unique buffs. So being able to run igneous weapons can be really nice, especially in a dungeon. For your group, you also get the minor brutality. Stagger is an ability that, honestly, most groups shouldn't really bother using, especially now since damage has gone so high. It's usually not going to be, the deciding factor on anything, and there is some cost to it. I would love to honestly see Stagger just go away. I don't think that DPS want to keep it up. I don't think most tanks want to keep it up, and I really wish it would just kind of go away. DKs have enough utility without it. I know DK is going to be mad at me. So someone out there is going to be mad at me for saying that, but I really think that would solve a lot of these issues where we have of putting too much stuff on a tank and it being kind of this awkward situation. It creates tension in the end game that just doesn't need to be there, and it doesn't really add that much, to be totally honest with you. DKs already have enough unique buffs with their Mountain's Blessing, giving minor brutality, and so on. Ulti-Gen, I want to talk about Ulti-Gen a little bit. We didn't talk about it earlier. The thing with Ulti-Gen is basically basically every class has something like this where they generate the equivalent of 0.5 ultimate per second under some condition. Now, some classes and some abilities, like here with the Earth and Heart ability, we're probably not going to be proccing this very often on a Dragon Knight tank anymore. And honestly, there's most classes, or about half the classes, are like that with some ability. The ulti-gen, though, guys, we can get so much ultimate from other things now that the ultimate generation on your actual class isn't that important for the most part, right? If you're trying to permanently Magma Shell, maybe it would matter there. But now we can get major heroism via Trample from the scribing skill line. So really, ultimate generation is really not that big of a deal. We will see a little bit later that there is one class that is just like S tier, far and above everybody else, and I think that could matter, but otherwise it really doesn't, to be totally honest with you. All right, now let's go and move on to the Nightblade here. So we've gone through the recoveries. We can see that we get some of that from our Refreshing Shadows passives, while blocking is our siphoning attacks. We've got our Executioner passive. This is one that didn't make it onto the list, really. Executioner, what this does is it gives you 1,000 magicka and stamina when an enemy damaged by you dies within 2 seconds. There are a couple of classes with this kind of ability that give you a bunch of resources when something dies. It's awesome when it can happen and when there's a situation that makes a lot of sense, but it's very situational. So it's not something I think you want to factor in to your decision-making process about that particular class, but just know about it is a nice feature that they have. Mirage is, both morphs of the skill are great. One morph will give you remove all snaring and mobilizing effects from you, which can be really nice situationally. And the other thing it does that's really nice is that it'll reduce, for taking direct damage, each time you do, it reduces the cost of your dodge rolls by 10% to the point where they can be absolutely free. On fights where you need a dodge roll and just kind of passively, this is a great for your stamina sustain on a Nightblade, and so that's why we have it mentioned here. Unique damage mitigation, mass hysteria. I will note here that this used to be a little bit better for the Nightblade, but now with scribing you can get, major cowardice in a lot of different places and put it on maybe on your chain or something. And so it's not that big of a deal, but it's AoE, which if you're in a situation where you need AoE major cowardice, you can't really get this. There might be a scribing skill, but not one you would typically use as far as I'm aware. Someone correct me if I'm wrong about this one, but I think this has lost some utility because definitely for single targets, there are other sources of it that make a lot of sense for you on a tank. Healing. So we've already talked about Shrewd Offering. This is our burst heal. Heals for about as much as a combat prayer on a healer that's fully buffed, just so you guys know about what it does, which is pretty legit. You also passively get heals over times of about 4k per second. So this is our Dark Cloak and then Siphoning Strikes together. One gives like 1.5k, then one gives 2.5k. Added up, you get 4.5 or you get 4k. If you're standing still, the Dark Cloak ticks for much more, and it'll be 8.5k while you're standing still. So kind of huge, to be totally honest with you. It's a really nice passive heal over time. You don't really count on this for Dark Cloak. If you're always moving, that's fine. But being able to stand still, which you can honestly in most fights, stand still for a couple of seconds, some huge heals here. And I personally recommend that all Nightblades learn to keep up Dark Cloak basically 100% of the time. Here we have it kind of broken out about the the different stats on that. I will note that on all of these, in all the classes, you might have been thinking while I was talking about them, hey, there's a bunch of other heal over times you can use. Most classes have some way of adding a bit of healing over time or adding something to their build. Just for me, that's more of like a secondary thing. It's not what's going to inform your decision about the class. And that's what this video is about, informing your decision about the class. The specifics of how to best use that class, you can find that kind of thing in my build guide videos, right? So just take a look at those, and I go more in depth on each class and what's useful and what you can use. Shield on a Nightblade, we have to use Warden Contingency, which works quite well. It's super nice that we have this now. For special utility, Shrewd Offering, you can heal your allies effectively, and it's pretty cheap. I highly recommend this. I do it all the time on my Nightblade because most groups are not super well optimized and things aren't always going perfectly well. I've kept a healer alive with this before in Sunspire or during, right before or during the beam phase where a healer was about to dot out themselves. So that probably saved a wipe. So it's pretty nice to be able to use. Group Major Expedition is nice via our Path of Darkness, either morph. We probably use the healing morph on our tank. Concealed weapon can give you minor expedition, which will give you extra speed. Being faster on a tank is actually incredibly useful in a lot of situations. In Dreadcell Reef on the Reef Guardians, Cloud Rest, running around with Zamagia, honestly countless others. Being fast, any trash pool is pretty nice, and not having to cast the skill here to get minor expedition is really quite nice on a tank. Our Shade here is a fun teleport, as is our Teleport Strike or Lotus Fan, whatever you want to use. The thing is, it's really fun, but it's just fun. It's not actually that useful most of the time. Like, you can shade past the storms on Teleria, for example, which would allow you to stand still and use the full, Dark Cloak bonus, but it's kind of just fun. It doesn't really add in there, to be totally honest with you. For unique buffs, we have our Hemorrhage passes, which provides minor savagery. I was talking with a friend, this is outside the scope of this video, a bit about raid group optimization, but in a trial setting, you typically don't need minor savagery. And that's unfortunate. You just don't need it, because you're always going to have a sorcerer in any optimized group, and so you just don't need this buff. I can go more into it in a different video, but just realize that. But it's nice for 4-mans, and hey, it's there. Ulti generation. So Nightblades have the same thing where they get 2 ulti every 4 seconds when casting a siphoning ability. This is basically our burst heal, right, using Shrewd Offering. Similar to other tank classes, except for we will actually keep this procced a fair amount, and we could proc it off cooldown if we really wanted to. And then we also have the Catalyst passive, which gives us 20 ult per potion drank. So that ups, so you got to think that 20 ult every 45 seconds, it's better than, a DK in some of the other classes. It's also not insane when you compare that you can do trample and do other things, but it is better than the other classes. Now a category just to let people know that there are things that will trick you and you'll think that are good that are really not. So Magicka Flood increases our max Magicka by 8%. This is a nice to have. My point is not that it doesn't matter for the class entirely, just that this is not something that you're like, oh, this will make me choose this class or not choose this class. It really is just kind of added into everything else. Similarly, with Soul Siphon, increases your healing done by 3% per siphoning ability slotted. Increasing your own personal healing done on a tank. I mean, sure, it's nice when you get it for free or you get it as part of something, but it's really not that important because you're usually not the primary source of your own heals. And if there are situations where you are, but an extra 10 or 3% is not usually going to change anything. It would be more about having better recovery so you can spam those heals more often and things like that. These 3% increases are for healers that are putting out 80k per second of healing, not you as the tank putting out, maybe 5-10k or something like that per second. Okay, it's just not as big of a deal. And then here on Dark Vigor, 3% max health per shadow ability slotted. Getting more max health does allow you to move around your attributes because you still want to aim for that 45k mark about there. But it's not part of the decision making on should I choose this tank or another tank class. And then as we mentioned, you have both minor protection and minor resolve. Now let's move on to the Arcanist. Arcanist, we went over, they have crazy high recoveries. They also have, part of that is Wellspring of the Abyss, which increases their recoveries by 129 per Soldier of the Apocrypha Seal slotted. We have Erudition, which gives us 18% increased magic and stamina recovery, just because, 3% more than our Nightblade up there. While blocking, you have Recuperative Treatise, which again is not a skill that a lot of people even run. It is one that if you want maximum survivability, you could absolutely slot it just for your own survivability, but it's kind of a niche skill, and it provides half the recoveries that most of the other skills do, so it's a little bit weak there. Hideous Clarity. So this is one where you get 225 magic or stamina, whichever is higher, when you generate Crux. So this actually can be a way of getting a decent amount of stamina back on a Arcanist. The thing is, depending on your build, you might not be generating Crux that often. It might be only 1 or 2 every 5 seconds, which makes this a very low value. So this could be something where it's kind of nice. It does something in the background, but I don't think it's consistent or large enough of a recovery for it to really warrant taking into account here, because again, if you're only getting this, maybe twice, if you're lucky, every 5 seconds, you're looking at about 100 recovery. With Recuperative Treatise, maybe you're getting up there to the point where you're getting equal with the other classes with your stamina recovery during block mitigation. But I just I don't know. Maybe I should have given this more weight than I did. But at this point in time, I'm just not convinced that it's something that maybe you only get one crux every 5 seconds, and then it's really not worth it. So, or maybe you get three and it's great. So it just kind of depends. And again, it's still going to be like half the value of most of the other things, and it really only adds up when you add in recuperative treatise, which I imagine was the plan for the Arcanist tank. I'm just not convinced this works incredibly well. This could be something where I'm wrong on, to be totally honest with you guys, but just keep that in mind. All right, then we have, we've already talked about Aegis of the Unseen. That's part of the way that we get our armor, and then Runic Sunder gives us the other portion of that, about 2k apiece. And so that just allows us to have more flexibility on what race we choose and how we kind of load out our character as far as the weapons, the traits on our weapons, if we're going to do a two-piece, with some sort of armor on it, or how we're moving around our CP. So a lot of options there on an Arcanist. We already talked about the healing, evolving Runemen. Most people don't use this. This was best for an apples to apples comparison. And since you actually use your Spite Ward of the Lucent Mind to get a lot of your healing on an Arcanist, it just kind of was awkward to talk about it. So I was just trying to make an apples to apples comparison. A lot of people that I know on an Arcanist will just kind of stack damage shields, and that way they can let go of block a little bit more and be able to heavy attack with a sword and board to get back resources. I have a very sweaty friend who's very knowledgeable about the game, and he says that Arcanist is the only class that he still runs a sword and board on, and you can do that on Arcanist without missing anything because of some of their unique buffs, and we'll talk about that in a second. For special utility, Fleet-Footed Gate. It's a teleport and gives you major expedition. Really nice for keeping up with groups in trials during trash or in dungeons, just running around. Has a kind of a built-in oh shit button with runic defense. I will note that runic defense, I've heard some other creators say that as long as you have this up, it's like it's such a great heal. I think it's nice. Okay, don't get me wrong, but runic defense only heals for like 5k. In my experience, it has not been that much. And so this is not the best oh shit button to me. I mean, a sorcerer gets that on their shield just for free, just for casting their shield. So again, it's nice, but it's not, to me, this is not the heal you want to be counting on in most situations. And then we also have Curative Surge. I didn't talk about this earlier, but Curative Surge, you can actually get this to be basically free if you run Tri-Stat Reduced Cost instead of just purely Magicka, which is what I would recommend on an Arcanist. And with that, you can make Curative Surge literally free. And you can just cast this on a tank, and it scales so well that even at the low end, it'll heal 9k per second, and then once it ticks up, you can get up to 25k. And that all of these are also assuming, usually on a tank you have very low crit, so I'm assuming you're not critting on any of these. It could actually be a bit higher, and you can actually heal your group. So this could be very useful in dungeons, or if you're an off tank in a trial, or if you get really good, it can be useful even as a main tank in a trial. So just keep that in mind. It is channeled, so you will have to be dropping block, but it's still pretty nice, and it's literally free. All right, unique buffs here. Xena's Empowering Disc. So this will give minor courage and minor recoveries. Really nice so that you can do this so that a DPS doesn't have to use it. It's not a big deal for a DPS or a healer to use this ability, but just know that it's there. And if you're in a 4-man group, these buffs will last for 10 seconds after they move out of the AoE, which means you can basically keep this up 100% of the time, even on very mobile fights for the most part. And then we also have Glyphic of the Tides. This is one, I really like Glyphic of the Tides on a healer, an Arcanist healer in Pillager's Prophet, but just know that it is an option. It'll also, give you spell power and weapon damage, but it also heals for a ton. So pretty nice ultimate there. And then we have for Ulti-Gen, we have Implacable Outcome. You consume Crux. Whatever you do, you gain 4 ultimate per 8 seconds. This is something that hopefully we'll be keeping up pretty well on Arcanist. And again, it's that 0.5 ultimate per second that we see as typical of most tanks. Things that don't matter, but you might think or be tricked into thinking they do. Fated Fortune increases our critical healing by 12%. As I mentioned earlier, so we have very low crit on a tank just to begin with, but also increased healing. I mean, 12% is a lot for critical healing, but even on a tank, we're not going to get it consistently enough, and healing isn't as much. We don't lean into that so much that it's really going to matter. And also on an Arcanist healer, we're mostly shielding, to be honest with you. Then we have Circumvented Fate, which gives the group minor evasion. It doesn't matter because we're always going to have an Arcanist in group. You just have to cast Arcanist abilities to give this buff to your group, so it's always going to be in group, for the foreseeable future. Then we have Healing Tides, 3% healing per active crux. We talked about healing plenty. It's just not that big of a deal. Intricate Rune Forms reduces the cost and increases the strength of shields by 10%. Now, this is one, like a lot of these things, where like, this is good. This is important, but this shouldn't inform your decision about the class because it just isn't that big of a deal. Now, once you're playing the class and you're on the class, you might want to, control where you're putting skills. Maybe you put your Glyphic on your front bar so you get this buff or something like that. So, keep it in mind, it matters for your class. It doesn't matter about making the choice about the class. Please don't get that confused because you'll get some wrong conclusions drawn from that. And then we have Ruin of the Colorless Pool, another one. So this is why we can sword and board. This will give us most of the buffs that we would typically get from running a sword and board by making sure that we have Brittle up 100% of the time and, other debuffs, the Minor Vuln and everything. So that's why we like Ruin of the Colorless Pool. It does take up a skill spot, but it saves us. We can run a sword and board on our front bar to be able to heavy attack if we need to. And then for, minor protection and minor resolve, we have both of those, both on Ruined Guard of Freedom, which is why we're always going to run that skill. And then after that, we're ready to move on to the Necromancer. So here we have sustain at, fairly significant, 2.1k and then 1.6k stam. Undead Confederates giving us a couple hundred recoveries there while we have our Spirit Guardian up. While blocking, we get 0 recoveries. Guys, this is one of those things. I'm going to do a video talking about tank, race choices in the near future. But this could be one where like you might want to run a red guard because then you get 200 back, which is in line with everybody else and could be very significant. For unique damage mitigation, we kind of talked about that already. For healing, we also talked about that as well. Warden contingency is going to be our shield. It's so nice that we all get a shield now. For special utility, so our beckoning armor will chain enemies kind of on its own. It's a magic costing ability. This has gone down in utility now, but this beckoning armor also gives us other buffs that we want, so it's still a really nice source of major and minor resolve. We have renewing animation. So this allows you to instantly res up to 3 allies and you become a tanking god. No, you could see this, guys. The other day, earlier this week, we did the new, with a couple of friends that are really sweaty end gamers, we did the new dungeons on hard mode going in blind. Okay. And there were times where we were learning mechanics and I was tanking. I was actually on a sorcerer, but I was tanking and I was the only one left alive because we'd failed mechanics or we didn't know what's going on or what have you. And, we're going in blind. There were times when we were low health that I could have dropped a necro res to get everybody else up, but there's no way I could have slow resed everybody. And we probably could have cleared 1 or 2 pulls before we did. Now, our group, obviously you can just learn what's going on with the particular fights and be fine, but NecroRes will absolutely get you through content, whether that's in dungeons or in trials. I've helped carry groups through content using the NecroRes. Okay. Now I know a lot of in-game players or many in-game players will be like, well, they don't deserve that clear. For me, the game is about having fun and I'm having fun. If I can help carry a group through content they didn't think they could get through. And so the NecroRes to me is just like, it's this S tier ability it's something you can't get on any other class, and it is the reward for the Necro being such a potentially difficult compared to the other classes, to tank on. So just keep that in mind. And again, if you run, instead of running a, Nord, if you run a Red Guard, it also alleviates a lot of that pain of being on a Necro class. So I strongly recommend Red Guard Necros. Okay. Ultimate generation. Your ultimate generation is ridiculous. Okay. So you can change out to where some of your scribing skills like trample actually leaves a corpse on the ground. And then if you use the magic version of blast bones to drop 2 more corpses, each one of those corpses is 6 ultimate whenever you use necrotic potency, which means you can generate 18 ultimate in 2.5 seconds. And then additional, you'll have your major heroism. Now with all of the various buffs and everything else, you get a lot. There's also, we'll talk about this more in the ulti generation, but you have corpse consumption as well. which gives you 20 ultimate every 16 seconds whenever you're consuming a corpse. It's kind of ridiculous. Expunge and Modify is a really nice cleanse that gives you back resources. This can be really helpful in certain dungeons, and in addition to helping you survive those dots and these debilitating effects, it also gives you a bunch of resources back, and works really well. Places that I'm thinking of that I use this, I can't remember. Castle Thorn? Yeah, Castle Thorn, where you have to like run around inside the AoE. I use it a lot there, but there's plenty of other places, and it's nice that it gives you back resources in a dungeon setting because we struggle with that a bit on the Necromancer. All right, unique buffs, major vulnerability via the Colossus. Now, you can get this from a lot of other sources now, a lot of different sets and everything else. It's still nice to have still nice to have at least one Necro in a group in most situations, and it can help fill in the gaps depending on what sets everybody's are wearing, and then nobody has to wear a set too, also, so you can just get it from your DK, or I'm sorry, from your Necro. All right, ulti generation, as I mentioned, it's S tier. The ulti generation, so most classes were like 0.5 a second, right? We just talked about if you kind of run the numbers, Necros are getting like 6 times that, all right? They get crazy high ulti generation compared to the other tanking classes. So corpse consumption with a 20 ultimate, as we talked about, then necrotic potency, which 6 ultimate per corpse. I will note that on necrotic potency, you get the ultimate immediately, and then you get the heal over time, so you can recast that. If you have a fight where there's a bunch of adds, you can get a crazy amount of ult. This is really nice in dungeons because on ad packs you can just keep, and even in trials, you get to suck up all those souls for the ad packs and then drop colos next. And if you're in an ad heavy fight, you get colos for days in dungeons. Really nice. Okay, things that you might think matter but actually don't. We have Mortal Coil. So it gives 85 magic and stamina per second, but it actually ticks every 2 seconds. Mortal Coil does not give you enough recoveries to warrant the bar space. The heal is really weak on it for a tank, and it's just not enough. I've tried to use this before, and it's just not good enough. If you are a new tank, where just go fully survivable, you've got too complicated of a rotation at that point for this to be useful. So Mortal Coil, I just don't recommend it at all. I don't think it does good enough. Play a red guard. Curative Curse. So while you're having a negative effect on you, increase your healing down by 8%. We've talked at length about why healing done isn't that big of a deal on a tank. Sure, it's nice, but it's not going to make or break your decision on what to choose. Near-death experience. While you're having a living death ability slotted, plus 20% healing critical. Again, it's a nice to have, but it doesn't really matter. Your healing critical chance is going to go from like 20% to 40% or 10% to 30%. It's not going to be that big of a deal. It's not going to make or break anything. You don't cast that many heals. Agony Totem. So this is, I say it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter for us for our source of minor protection because it's too expensive and it's stationary, and you typically don't want to use this on most tanks. I have used this as my source of minor protection, but that's at like a high level where you're trying to get full damage mitigation, and now we can get it from an easier source via our Warden contingency. I also used to use this for groups to kind of help protect them, and it will do that, although there are healing abilities that can also do that as well. So it's nice. It just probably shouldn't be factored into our decision making here. One thing here I didn't put on our healing is that we have Health Avarice, which can increase our healing received by 2 to 4%. It's based on how many skills a particular skill line we have. This is actually significant. Healing done by you isn't that big of a deal, but healing received actually is, and having an extra 2 to 4% healing received will be significant, especially if we have our healers on us doing their job. So just keep that in mind. And then for Minor Resolve here, we get this from our Bone Armor now, which is a really nice change, so we don't have to worry about running Vigor, which would further reduce our overall stamina that we have available. So really love this change, and that we don't need to run Resolving Vigor unless we're running Powerful Assault. All right, and then moving on to our Templar, we've gone over the recoveries. We talked about the Restoring Spirit passive, which reduces the cost of all of our abilities by 5%. And then we have Repentance. Repentance is something we can always have, which will increase our recoveries up to that 2K and 1.5K mark, which always gives us minor intellect and minor endurance, which increases our recoveries by 15% apiece, respectively, for their respective stat. And then we also have, you can use it to consume a corpse to heal for 3k and regenerate 3k stamina. So this is, again, like we talked about with the Nightblade, this is, and also with the Necromancer, this is a situation where whenever you have, a lot of ads that are dying or in trash, you can get a lot of recoveries back on a Templar, which can be really nice, but it's very situational. And then we have our runic focus here, which you can use either morph of. I will note the heal is only like 1k per second, but if you're standing within it, it goes up to 3.5k. You don't need the 3.5k. It's just kind of a nice to have. It gives all of its benefits, whether you're standing in it or not, other than that extra healing. So still a great skill. We talked about our unique damage mitigation with our sacred ground. We can increase our block. Our healing, of course, we have Honor the Dead, which we talked about at length. We also have Living Dark. And Living Dark, you want to keep up for the buffs that it can provide passively to the group in most pug groups or whatever. You could drop this in some situations, but Living Dark will heal you for about 2.2k whenever you take direct damage, and that could happen up to twice per second. This is an ability that is mostly useful in, kind of trash or ad heavy fights, but it is still nice. I mean, it could be, 2 to 4k depending on how many ads you have, could be more, but it's just a nice thing to know about and just keep in mind for ads. For shielding, we already talked about all that stuff. And then for special utility, a couple of things that are interesting. So Master Ritualist, 20% decreased res time. So that's awesome, being able to res people. Now, are you doing that very often on a tank? Not unless you're very experienced. But if you watch any of my tanking streams, you'll see that I do it all the time, especially in pug groups and new groups. So it being quicker, even though it's only 20%, will actually absolutely be a game changer. It means getting it off before having to stop to block a heavy attack. So it's actually pretty nice. Extended Ritual is a cheap group purge and a nice synergy for them, particularly important in 4-mans. Also, Extended Ritual is like the biggest AoE in the game. So even though this is stationary, it's massive. And if you place it properly, you won't have to recast it early, hardly ever. So it's just a nice thing to have. And then we also have Luminous Shards, which are a great synergy, particularly in 4-mans, that provide extra resources back for our group. Luminous Shards, that's just one of the special things that it does. So really nice in 4-mans for sustain, and just in general, you can also throw one of these to the other tank if you're in a trial group. So plenty of utility there. It's kind of a nice skill to have. Unique buffs, Minor Savagery. 10% increase spell damage when casting a Dawn's Wrath ability. So that's from the Illuminate passive. This is our unique class buff that a Templar can bring to the group. Note that oftentimes you can get Minor Savagery from a DK, so you don't really need this buff in your group because you'll always have a DK. But if you're in a dungeon, maybe you could be providing this unique buff, so keep that in mind. For ulti gen, we have Prism. Casting a Dawn's Wrath ability will generate 3 ult. Guess what? Every 6 seconds, all right? So it's about that 0.5 ulti gen, similar to other classes. Are you going to be casting this every 6 seconds? Absolutely not. So probably more like you'll be casting it once every 12. You could change this up, but it doesn't really matter. It's a couple of ultimate. Now ultimate generation is out of control, so this becomes less important. All right, things that don't matter, but you might think they do. Mending. Increase your healing by up to 12% based on missing health. So what this does is it makes our burst heal for an extra, 1k or something like that, or 1.5k or whatever it ends up being. It's nice. It's not going to affect our decision on choosing a class. And then we have Lightweaver. Generate 2 ult when you heal an ally under 50% health. It's just not going to come up for us as a tank very often, to the point that it actually matters. And then for minor protection, we do have our Spear Wall ability, which is, whenever we cast a skill from that skill line, we get minor protection for 6 seconds. This is basically our shield. Whenever we cast our shield, our class shield, which also lasts for 6 seconds, will have minor protection. So as long as you're using that shield, you should have this up whenever you need it. All right, let's move on to Sorcerer. So Sorcerer, we're doing well on our recoveries. We also have Dark Deal. So I want to talk more about this. Dark Deal drops block for it takes 1 second to cast, a channel cast, but it heals you for about 14k, gives you back 3.6k stamina instantly, and another 2.4k over 10 seconds. an amazing skill, and you need to use this skill or one other in the skill line to keep up your unique buffs for your group on a sorcerer. So Dark Deal can be our burst heal. Just realize it does drop block, but I mean it's 1 second, which is almost half the time of a heavy attack. The massive heal, incredibly cheap, and it's awesome. So, I would slot this on my bar whenever I'm really worried about survivability. I might even put it in one of my flex spots so I have both heals on my bar and debuffs. So just keep that in mind. Unholy Knowledge. This reduces the cost of non-core combat abilities by 6%. So this gives you the equivalent, if you're casting every second, of 150 resource, or when you cast the skill rather, it's the equivalent of saving 150 resources on a 2.5k, costing skill. So significant, right? We talked about, 200 per second being a decent recoveries, being something you can really notice. Then we have Daedric Protection, which increases our HP and stam recovery by 20%, while a Daedric summoning skill is slotted, which we will always have. So that's why, it just really helps our stamina recovery, really nice. Then we have Capacitor, increases our mag recovery by 10%. Just again, a really nice to have. These are passive things. So as you notice, your mag recoveries go up, these percentage increases will give you more back. Just something to keep in mind. Persistence, after blocking an attack, your next ability costs 15% less. I mean, it's nice to have. It's great to have on the Sorc, but we're not going to really be able to control this or really even be able to quantify it. We might choose a cheap costing skill. We might choose a high costing skill. Probably what it's going to do after blocking an attack, we're going to eat a heavy that we needed to block, and then we're going to cast a heal. So it's probably going to be significant on our burst heal, but it's only that one cast. So again, how much does that totally affect things? In the grand scheme of things, it's going to average out to be a fairly small number, but at the time it happens, it'll probably be more significant. But I don't think it's a reason to choose or not choose the class. While blocking, we've got our Dark Deal. It gives us that 2.4k, I keep saying wanting to say 24k, 2.4k stam over 10 seconds. It gives that rest of that back to us even while we're blocking. So that's why I have that kind of mentioned here, even though, again, it's odd that you have to drop block. For unique damage mitigation, we've gone over Bound Aegis. We didn't go over Vibrant Shroud. Vibrant Shroud is what I typically use for my heal, and I use it for my heal really for this major maim that it applies, and the fact that it can heal your group too. So this just provides major maim. It's an AoE and really the only class that you can get AoE major maim and put it on a bunch of targets, and it lasts for 10 seconds. So I usually just cast this once every 10 seconds as my burst heal, and otherwise use my shield, which will also heal us as we talked about. Then for healing, we got Vibrant Shroud, as we mentioned already, Dark Deal, we did the math on that. We have Minor Vitality, which comes from our Vibrant Shroud as well. So that's why we keep that buff up once every 10 seconds to increase our own healing received from our healers. And then for shield, we use our Hardened Ward, which again heals us for about 5k, in addition to being twice as big of a shield as most other classes have, while not costing much, if anything, more. Then we have unique buffs here. We've got Minor Prophecy, which will increase critical rating. That's why oftentimes you want a Sorc in your group. And then we have Major Berserk via the Storm Atronach. So even on a tank, we will often use our Storm Atronach to provide this 10% increased damage that Minor Berserk provides, because there's not really any other good place to get this in a group setting. So oftentimes other people, if you're in a trial, will run Warhorn and what have you, and you'll instead run the Storm Atronach. So similar in a bit in ways to the Necro's ultimate, you have the Storm Atronach instead of that. And then for ulti-gen, we actually don't have ulti-generation. We have Power Stone, which reduces the cost of our ultimates by 15%, okay? So that means we can cast ultimates more often on a sorcerer. A little bit different there. And how that works is really just going to depend on how often you're using your ultimate, how efficient that is. And then things that you might think matter, but actually don't. For choosing a class, we have Expert Summoner, which increases by 10% our magicka and stamina. Again, nice to have, but not something that's going to inform our decision. And then we have Minor Protection and Minor Resolve via Bound Aegis. All right, now for our Warden. So we've gone over our recoveries. We also have the Flourish passive. So wardens are interesting. You get 12% recovery with an Animal Companion ability slotted. So typically what you do on a Warden tank is you put your bear on your front bar as your ultimate to get 10% recovery, or 12% versus 10% that you would get from PvP skills. Kind of a weird thing, but it's what we do. Nature's Gift passive gives 200 mag or stand. We talked about this when healing an ally. This doesn't count yourself as far as I can tell, so it's when healing somebody else. And then, of course, our while blocking, we've went over that. All right, now for unique damage mitigation, we have Frozen Armor passive. This gives us 990 armor per Winter's Embrace ability slotted. Typically for me, this is 1 or 2. I've talked to some really sweaty friends that said they've loaded up their bar with more skills from this skill line just to make sure they were at cap in some particular situation. So again, there's some utility here, but mostly it's the opportunity cost, right? This might free up a CP or something else. Healing or a trait or a set 2-piece set on our front bar or what have you. One of those things. As we've gone over, our healing is crazy cracked on the Warden. For shield, we've got our Warden contingency is what we're going to use. We also have the Piercing Cold passive, which gives us 12% block mitigation. This has a proc condition, but it should always be up for the most part. 4 unique buffs here. We've got our Maturation passive, which gives minor toughness to anybody we heal, which increases their total health pool by 10%. This is a unique buff that only Wardens can provide at this point in the game, and usually you get this from a healer, but it's nice to have if you're in a 4-man group or if you don't, for some reason, have a Warden healer. And then we also have Ice Fortress, which will provide Major Resolve in an AoE. So both morphs do this. One does it in a larger area. We can provide Major Resolve. Again, typically a healer will run this and we'll keep it up, but it's there for us. We can absolutely use it if we're in a 4-man group. This is significant, guys. That will reduce damage taken by a decent amount. For ulti generation, we have Savage Beast. When casting an animal companion skill, generate 4 ultimate every 8 seconds. 0.58 ultimate a second, as we've noted. Doesn't matter. So accelerated growth, healing someone under 40% will give you major mending. This doesn't happen often enough. I mean, major mending is really nice, but I just don't think this happens often enough for us to really factor this into the class. It's a nice to have, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it's good enough that it's going to inform our decision about this being or not being the tanking class for us. And then we note that from their Ice Fortress that we get minor protection. And then special utility, our Betty Netch will give us a free cleanse. It kind of passively cleanses us. Falcon's Swiftness gives us a bit of speed and also removes immunity, provides immunity to snares and immobilizing effects. And then also Crystallized Shield just gives you a huge missile shield. And I personally would recommend this morph as we can get the major heroism that would be from the other morph historically. We can get that for free, or not for free, but we can get that from another skill, Trample, right now from the scribing. So anyways, guys, I think that's it. My goal with this, again, was just to try to give the most thorough and in-depth comparative analysis on the various tank classes, and I hope that I've done that. If I've made any mistakes, got anything wrong, let me know down in the comments. Hopefully you guys already have. And I also just want to say that, all of this compiled together, many people helped me with this, okay? And many more over the course of, the years, right? And there's a lot of really great people in the in-game community that just want to help other players have fun, and we like nerding out about stuff. We do stuff like this because it's fun, because we enjoy it. We're curious, it's interesting, and I just want to say thank you to all those people that are curious, that are open-minded, that are down for trying new things, but are also willing to pass on their wealth of knowledge. There's so many more people that know a lot more than I do, and it's just really nice. They pass it on, not just to me, but I mean just to everyday players that they meet with, that they talk to pass on their knowledge. Appreciate you guys. You do a lot for the community. I appreciate you guys watching. We'll have a lot more videos following up with maybe some group optimization, talking more about individual scribing skills, what you want on your bar as a tank in the near future. But I appreciate you guys watching. Have a good day, and we'll catch you in the next one.